it's why a lot of programs are successful where they do take a classic periodization approach in the endurance world, and there's this base, a lot of base zone 2 training, or aerobic threshold, sub-aerobic threshold training that occurs, and then closer towards the key event, like you said, 6 to 8 high intensity key sessions, probably specific to the context of the sport that's in question, and it does a great job to top up and give you that extra couple percent to bring you into fine form, done correctly, before a key event. There is just this little extra thing that you get, and again, going back to experiential stuff, you keep if you hit too much of this for too long, without kind of cycling that program a little bit, you can run into these troubles. Well, hello again, and welcome to episode 2 of the Training Science Podcast. I'm Paul Larson, and this is Martin Bichette, and we are excited to bring you the physiological targets of conditioning. So what we're going to do first off is we're going to just briefly review a little bit of what we went over last podcast, and that was really the context. We're talking about how important that context is. That context drives the content. And that's, we were giving some examples last podcast of the various different things. We were talking about the long-term adaptations that you've got to consider before you put down a training session. We were talking about the individual athlete and how that is, you've got a certain animal that steps up in front of you, and they can be completely different than that another animal that comes in. So, and we're talking a little bit about fiber type makeup or phenotype. There's so much research that's coming out about this, and how you really need to almost know if you've got like a diesel engine kind of athlete versus a twitchy athlete. And there's probably different training sessions that are gonna be applied for those different athletes. So tell us a little bit about that context, Mark.
I think it comes down to the individual as a starting point is super important. So you talked about fiber types, but what about injury profile as well? Previous injuries. What about other factors that are associated with injuries? Player coming back from an injury, you might still need to be conditioned as the others, but we have to probably often be way more mindful about the neuromuscular load of the session, so that we kind of build up this load in terms of running mileage, these kind of things. So this is the acute context that is related to the athlete itself. If they have any weaknesses, if they have any types of deficits, that's probably more important sometimes to consider that as an entry that will dictate the type of work they would do, rather than just the overall metabolic objective if we talk about high intensity training. Mm-hmm. So this is where you consider the format, like player coming back from injury. Is he able to run as much as the others? Probably not. So we might consider doing this conditioning session on a bike for him, or a heavy rugby player that doesn't need to run more, so that you won't have any back problems. So also this guy might do some conditioning on a bike, for example. So this is a context that is related to the athlete itself, in addition to when you were mentioning the muscle fibers. There's also coming a lot from preference, historical culture, used to do that or not. That's still around the athlete itself. But when I'm thinking about context, I always think about what happens on a daily basis. So I think on the former episode, I was giving an example of sleep, for example, where for any reason an athlete has not slept as much as he should have. So in this case, might not be the goal will not be to change the format, but maybe the length or the volume or the intensity of the session, for example. And if you don't have those tools in your head to be able to adapt, to still get to your point, but changing a little bit the parameter of the session, then it can be a bit of a challenge. Yeah, I think you have, I'm sure, some example when you were coaching those guys, Paul, as well, where they just come one day and they're not in the mood to do a hard session, or they have other psychological status that just prevent them to do the session you wanted. So you adapt on that day, and the session that you were meant to do, you do it the next day, or I'm sure you have billions of examples like that.
Yeah,
also.
well, think about it. Right? Yeah, it happens all the time, right? So you've got your plan. This is, you're going along, and there's that maybe there's on a regular basis they're able to complete those sessions as prescribed on for multiple weeks, and then for whatever reason they are just so flat. They're flat as a tack. There's no central drive. Are you really going to force that athlete and push that athlete to perform a session that they just know is is kind of not in there? Well, one, can they actually even do it? Two, is it even wise to go and do that if the central nervous system is completely taxed? No, you've got to change the session in the context. You've got to, it's either do nothing or have a light recovery walk or spin on the bike and move those sessions around. You'll get back on track later on to hit those physiological targets, which we will get to today. But yeah, it's so important. And, I guess we can't emphasize it enough to really know your context first and foremost before we go in and start programming things. There's so many factors.
Yeah, and I think that's probably also what drove our willingness to get this podcast running, is to uncover even further what are the different contextual factors that our colleagues and friends are actually using when they plan training. As you said, it's unique to each environment, and the kind of contextual factors that you may use to select a given training content in one sport might be different to another. There are probably sports where players, you always take the example of those resilient rugby players, they do or a martial arts type of athletes, no pain, no gain. Those guys, you probably need you probably have a lesser need to adjust the training content based on their mood or their fatigue, because they're going to go hard anyway, While there's other athletes, that's probably more the football. You don't want to create soreness. You don't want to create pain, because you want them to stay in a kind of a flow. You don't want to go through some peaks and valleys in terms of forms and wellness, these kind of things. So this is so interesting to also to be able to uncover how again, I'm talking about the next episodes, about our colleagues in different sports. What are their clues? What are they seeking for when they try to change their programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to get into some eventually we'll get to the point here where we've appreciated our context. We need to grasp some understanding of how the body works, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the cool thing about HIIT science and maybe us, is that first and foremost, we take a human approach. We take a human physiology approach. And that's what we but we spent a lot of time in the trenches, chasing molecules around test tubes and hanging out in the lab and figuring out how the different things of physiology work. Read a lot of frickin' papers and these sorts of things, but yeah, that's what we want to save some people some time. I think that's one of the other things you said off, is if I could take a course like HIIT Science, where you can just basically cut down the 20 years that I spent researching things, and you can get it in a couple hours, then that probably that might be worth it. So that's sort of what we're going to try to teach here. And that's what we'll go over briefly here. We're going to go through basically the 3 physiological targets at the end of the day that we've kind of got excited about, and the things that you're going to want to pay attention to when you're about to finally produce a conditioning session. Okay, so yeah, the very first target is typically many of these systems. It depends on the context. We'll put up that really cool figure that you put together, Martin, with the whole. I guess you stole it from Natter or something like that in MSSE in 2007, I think it was, from memory. And it was basically that one where you're looking at the y-axis and you've got the degree of strength and speed that's required, and then you've also got the various different the endurance components on the x-axis, and then you've got the various different sports that are around there. And that's another huge contextual factor too, right? Like, what is the sport that we're kind of considering? But based on those, you're going to start to appreciate how much of an aerobic component, and that's the first physiological target that we're looking at, is how much whenever we're conducting a conditioning session, how much aerobic component do we kind of want in there. And I guess with that aerobic component, we've got our central and our peripheral components. So take us through, when you think of central components, Martin, what are you thinking of the aerobic system? What are you talking about? What does it mean to you?
What likely matters really in terms of acute response and adaptation is more likely the time spent in the red zone when you're close to your maximal oxygen uptake. This is where all your system is just working at the highest rate. That includes the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and also at the molecular muscle level. But in terms of, if we bring back that to the pitch, I don't think anyone conducts a session with a gas analyzer. So it's about spending times in the red zone in terms of at least of heart rate, because that's something we measure. Even though we know there are a lot of limitations in assessing the actual oxygen uptake type of response using heart rate only, because of the limitation, and there's a lot of things about especially the inertia about heart rate, the fact that heart rate is only a part of the overall cardiac output and so on. And I think I don't need to go further into detail because there's a lot of in the book and in the course about that. But for practitioners, it's about really the central exertion that we measure essentially via heart rate at the moment. So spending some time in the red zone, that's definitely how we can assess this first target, the aerobic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, let's geek out just for a brief moment. But what's actually going on when you are hitting that red zone? So we've got I can think of a couple things, right? So that heart is being stretched, and it kicks back in, and it actually builds in terms of it's like how much it's going to rebound the second time. The heart muscle actually grows and becomes stronger another time. And yeah, there's probably things that are going on, cerebral deoxygenation as well. So that these are all the various different central components that are likely adapting. But yeah, like why would you want that? Well, it's delivery of oxygen is so critical to performance, right? So you've got bigger central delivery, and you're gifted with that, or you build that. Well, you're going to definitely be doing pretty well in a lot of various different contexts within both obviously within endurance sports, but also within some team sports as well.
Yeah, on that, I think it's important to understand that the use of this aerobic system will have different aims depending on the sports. A well-developed aerobic system will directly drive performance in a lot of endurance sports, especially like I think it's in rowing where you have the highest correlation between VO2 max and performance. So that's really driving the performance. While in team sport, the aerobic system is rather supporting the performance because it's actually helping more to recover rather than obligatory to do. Yeah, it's in endurance sport, it's about doing more work, running faster or pushing further on your pedals on the bike. So it's producing more work. in team sports, it's not about doing more work, but doing it better. So there's a qualitative aspect that is in the recovery, the ability to recover better in between those high intensity efforts. So the goal is different. It's guiding versus supporting performance. But whatever the context, again, we need a minimum level of aerobic power and capacity. And this is probably where, again, the context gets back in, is how much is enough for the different sports. I don't think you can say it's enough, or there is a level that is enough for marathon runners and rowers, because it's likely that the more they get, the better they're going to be. For team sport, there's likely a threshold that is likely to be enough to allow them to do their job well, which is definitely more passing and kicking balls than running. So this is this exact context that is going to drive also the amount that is required. You're going to have to do 1 or 3 conditioning sessions a week, for example. Again, that's how the demands of the sport drive this aspect.
I was just going to say that, so 100%. So for example, some of my triathletes that are winning like Ironman races, they'll be getting up to around 30 hours of training in a given week, and we almost sort of want to see that in the guys who are the best. They don't have to do that, but I've seen a lot of success with that. And it's like, well, how do you actually go and do 30 hours of training, aerobically? And that's a puzzle in itself. But I guess my question for you from the team sports context, and I don't know the answer to this, but have you ever come across different situations where team sport athletes really aren't aerobically trained enough? Because that's, I would imagine that there's certain old-fashioned coaches that would just train to play, right? Like you just train more and you're going to get that aerobic conditioning. But do you ever come across where it's like you're actually almost seeing a limitation in that player's performance because they're not aerobically conditioned enough? Like the guy didn't recover, and if he had recovered, he would have been able to get that he would have been able to hit that that play again or whatever, and race, done another couple reps.
Sure, of course that happens. Or you just see a player at start of the preseason versus full in season, when they get in the rhythm and they get this, what we often call this kind of specific fitness, where they can just repeat efforts within a match and repeat matches, even several matches within the week. So this aerobic fitness gives them this ability to repeat, which they don't have at some stage of the season, or if they're kind of missing a little bit this component. So it's crucial. But then again, there's a level where being fitter will not really translate to improved performance, and or the efforts that may be required to improve this fitness more might not be worth in relation to all the other things that they may have to train for, whether is it other physical capacities or just the technical and tactical aspects. There's a trade-off, a cost-benefit into the effort that needs to be put on to improve fitness.
And I recently read your 20-year review of the 30-15 intermittent fitness test. Amazing. And that's the first thing that kind of comes to my mind, is that you have this really cool spot in the paper where you're saying, you're probably gonna, I forget what it was, I think it was like 12 to 16 sessions of high intensity training or aerobic conditioning training is probably, you're not going to really see too much more improvement in the 30-15 IFT. And granted, you're capturing a bunch of different parameters that are sort of within that, but I think that kind of goes to a little bit like that, right? Like you're not going to get if you're hitting these guys too much more after that, you're kind of wasting your time. You'd best be almost focusing on something else.
Yeah, at least on this specific evaluation, which is the 30-15, you might still get further adaptation on your running academy side of the things that might not be enough to be translated in what you assess with the 30-15. Adaptation might translate at other level. But I think you relate to this figure in this paper. It's kind of a meta-analysis with very simple and, let's say, limited statistical adjustments, to be very fair. but I would say, yeah, you get studies that with even 6 to 8 sessions, they already more or less at this ceiling effect, which is again bringing a lot of that we kept saying that from the start with the book and everything, and we were by far not the first to say that and to highlight the time efficiency of high intensity interval training, that you get roughly 1 or 2 kilometers, whether it be maximal aerobic speed or the speed at the 30-15, you can improve by 1 or 2 kilometers your speed at those tests with 6-8 sessions. We can fit in a couple of several weeks, in a month of time, which is incredible. So
it is.
Yeah.
And it actually, and again, going back to coaching context, and I'm thinking with the endurance sport hat on. It's why a lot of programs are successful, where they do take a classic periodization approach in the endurance world, and there's this a lot of base zone 2 training, or aerobic threshold, sub-aerobic threshold training that occurs, and then closer towards the key event, like you said, 6 to 8 high intensity key sessions, probably specific to the context of the sport that's in question. And it does a great job to top up and give you that extra, couple percent to bring you into fine form, done correctly, before a key event. There is just this little extra thing that you get. And again, going back to experiential stuff, you keep, if you hit too much of this for too long, without kind of, cycling that program a little bit, you can run into these troubles. Back to the athlete I was just dealing with the other day, where there was this overall fatigue that's in that athlete, and we needed to adapt the program quite quickly, because it was probably almost too much high intensity work that was going on, and this athlete just needed to do something else ultimately. So we've talked about the central stuff, and we should just finish up to say that there's almost like these 2 targets within the aerobic system. We've talked about the central one. We're talking mostly heart and lungs, but there's also this peripheral system too, and it kind of can be adapted a little bit the same, but also a little bit different. We're really talking about the how desaturated you can actually get with your the actual muscles themselves. So how much oxygen ultimately that they lose. I kind of go back to some of the studies that you were doing we were doing together in the ECU lab, Martin, where we hooked up oximeters ultimately to people's muscles, and we looked at, with different forms of training, how desaturated their muscles became. So what do you remember about some of those studies we were doing with Chris and Prue and Jeremiah?
Yeah. Yes, I think the short repeated sprints on this Woodway treadmill were okay, even though they were pretty hard and lactic. But the sprint intervals on the bike, like those 30-second all out repeated wind gates, we had a few vomits, I think, at the end, and that was where we were reaching maximal saturation. So like at the same level that you will reach after 30-45 seconds of complete occlusion, passive in this case, just with the sprint and the muscle pump effect, plus just the need for oxygen from the cells that just suck all the oxygen. That was pretty interesting how important the desaturation happened. And even though there's not completely a consensus around the link between the actual desaturation and how the anaerobic glycolysis is triggered, and we're going to discuss about that, funnily, those very intense intervals are also drivers for the improvement for the oxidative enzymes. So, and that's why probably all the stuff from Martin Gibala and his team have really changed a little bit the way people have understood those very intense intervals, is that while doing a very, very minimum amount of work in terms of work done, you can still have oxidative adaptation at the muscle level. But in this case, as I say, it's at the muscle level, so it's completely peripheral. So forget about improving your cardiac function, forget about improving your respiratory function. But at the muscle level, the intensity is so strong that even though those aerobic enzymes are improved. And this is the beauty then you understand about high intensity interval training with regard to the aerobic system, is that whatever the intensity or whatever how you place yourself in terms of format, in terms of long versus short intervals, that comes almost at the opposite way with intensity. The shorter the interval, the higher the intensity. You always touch a part of this system, whether it is more peripheral or more central, but you always get something from it. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is, and it's it's been said before, but it's time efficient exercise as well, right? And so I mean, it depends on how you skin the cat, of course. We can a lot of times with these super maximal type efforts that you're describing, we are often, initially there is this glycolytic forte, but when it's repeated, there's the signal that you're giving it is actually quite aerobic, right? So we want to geek out. We can talk about AMPK and basically it basically produces more mitochondria. Mitochondria, of course, the energy powerhouses. And remember that mitochondria, based on the signal that you're giving it, that desaturation where we started, it's making more mitochondria in your larger fast twitch muscle fibers. They're going to then become more fatigue resistant, and the buffering is going to be better of the acids that are in there. They're going to produce ATP aerobically. These are good things, right? So this is why, it's great to sort of have those types of aerobic adaptations. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's good to have this option in terms of format of work to trigger aerobic adaptation, because those formats are obviously way better tolerated by some type of athletes, depending on the fiber types. They are also way better culturally tolerated by a lot of team sport athletes. So if you can't bring those guys on long intervals, bring them on short, because they're going to love it and it's going to be way better tolerated, and you still get some adaptation. There might not be the same adaptation, but you get something. And again, if you think about team sports where you really need to support the repeated sprint ability, for example, it's probably even more important to have an improved peripheral system than a central in this case. So happy days, works well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you're almost alluding there a little bit to the anaerobic speed reserve, anaerobic power reserve, basically different phenotypes, different, your twitchy athlete versus your diesel athlete. We're actually going to be producing a whole new course on that coming up very shortly in HIIT Science. So you can learn about, get ready and get ready to learn about that shortly. I think we've hit the aerobic system pretty solid, mate, and I think we'll kind of move next into the the anaerobic system, the anaerobic glycolytic system. We started alluding it to there with the peripheral adaptations, but what are the when you think about this system, trying to optimize it, what sort of contexts do you want to try to optimize this system for? But maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, when we mention anaerobic system, like that's also the feedback we got from people in the book or the course. People sometimes think also about the lactic part of the things, the phosphocreatine stuff, and that's not really what we refer to here. We're definitely referring more to the lactic side of the things. So the kind of glycolysis that happens with the production of lactate, and that's really the entry and the idea. And about the purely lactic things, that's really about more the proper strength, speed work that is a little bit outside of our HIIT world, I would say. So back to the lactic side of the things. I think if you for any athlete, whatever the sport and the context, if you mention that the session is going to be lactic, the first thing that is going to come to their mind is going like, oh, shit, it's going to be hard. It's going to be painful, you know. Not always at the level of meeting the bucket, but it's going to be hard. And so that's one side. There's a very important contextual side of the thing. That do you want really your athletes to puke in this case? For many reasons, but because they probably have to be concentrated for the rest of the day, the rest of the session. They already had a hard session or game the other day, so you just want to decrease this perception of this hard session, and it's often not needed. But sometimes that's what you want, you know, players back from an injury. You want to prepare him for hard moments. We use sometimes the expression worst case scenario, this kind of thing. Sometimes you want a hard session. So it's not like being good or bad, but it's more about what you want. And the other, of course, big consideration about planning a session that is more or less lactic is, again, demand of the sport, moment in the season. Are you in the cycle where you want to develop this physical capacity? Fine, look for sessions that are more lactic than others. Again, completely context dependent. In team sports, most of the time, you don't always need to produce a lot of lactate if you look at the average of a game, but sometimes you may have to just go back and forth and do a couple box to box in a football pitch, and these 5 intense minutes might be actually, that might help to be able to produce some lactate also, because that's also another source of energy. So you have to consider the position in this case, and it really depends. Then if you go more track and field or track cycling.
Rugby sevens or rugby sevens, friends. I kind of think of some of those in HIIT Science, or watching some of the videos of those guys.
Exactly. Wow. Those sports, they just need athletes to produce a lot of lactate. So fair enough. So just do it. And then in this case, it makes complete sense to use almost exclusively sessions that actually help to produce and to trigger this system also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think you alluded to it, but what are some of the, what happens when we're producing a lot of lactate? What are some of the programming considerations that we've got to consider for, what's going to be the consequence of putting a lactic session in there, like we we're just talking about? What do you think of as a practitioner?
Well, as I started with, definitely the pain associated with, for sure, that has a direct psychological effect on the session and the overall dynamic of the microcycle, maybe. But it can also be related to, or you can also affect recovery on the short term, both at the metabolic level. Those sessions definitely even more like high intensity anyway, but plus a lot of lactate production that might still consume. You're going to use a lot of glycogen. And if you're too close to a match, that's probably not what you want either. Too close to a competition, you just want your athletes to start the competition with a high level of glycogen so that they can use it during the competition, There's also the acute fatigue effect on the neuromuscular system, which we're going to talk after also about this. That's our third target. We know very well that there's not a direct relationship between lactate and muscle fatigue, but all the perturbation that happens at the muscle level associated with lactate production are also associated with inability for the muscle to contract properly, which is the basis of muscle fatigue. So is this that you want? Are you willing the players to finish this session with some muscle fatigue or not? Depends, again, on the context. What are they doing the day after or an hour after, for example?
Mm-hmm. So I would think, when I've prescribed these sorts of things, that I describe it as it throws the athlete. It throws the athlete around. It messes with their central nervous system. I see, if we're measuring heart rate variability, it's probably going to be in the tank the next day. So there's something happening. Like there's something's happening in most individuals, most all individuals with that huge sympathetic drive to recruit all of that musculature for eliciting these large anaerobic. It's again associated with the anaerobic system and the large lactate production. It comes with that central effect. So you got to consider it in your context. You got to consider it in your programming. And maybe that's you did this really cool thing. We're going back to the science aspect now, and we're going almost to the reviews that we wrote in 2013, and continue on in our book and course. But you almost, when you were looking at the different types of sessions, you were looking at the different types of classifications, and you had these cool things where you're looking at the amount of lactate that's produced in 5 minutes. To classify these as basically either aerobic to be strongly anaerobic. How was that received for you, Martin, when you looked at that analysis from the academic community?
Yeah, I remember that. The thing, the academic community once again wants things perfect, but one thing that just can't be done. So as we know, it's impossible to measure the actual contribution of the anaerobic system or the lactic anaerobic system within the muscle when you want to do just real life sessions. So another option would be to measure what we call the oxygen deficit, the accumulated oxygen deficit, but that requires gas, that requires a lot of profiling before, so you have an idea of the energetic cost of everyone, and then you just make the difference between the oxygen that you actually used versus the oxygen that could have been used if they had as much as they could, and the difference is supposed to be brought by the lactic system. So it's just impossible. So what everyone does, and every single study that we manage to bring back into this kind of type of meta-analysis, like people measure blood lactate because that's what we are after. But we know blood lactate is only the results of what has been both produced and already removed and eaten by your muscle, brain, and other organs. So what is in the blood is not the production, is already an equilibrium, a balance. So that's the first big limitation. But further than that, if you always to look at the end HIIT session lactate, because all those sessions are always in the severe high intensity zone, so they're always hard. So because they're always hard, they always end up with lactate that is about 9, 10, 12, 14. So it's always a high lactate at the end. So if we just wanted to use end HIIT session lactate to categorize all those sessions, we would say that all the same. They all end up with the same blood lactate levels. So we had to find something. And back in the early 2000s, I was following a course from Giannicola Bisciotti, and he had this really brilliant idea to look at the rate of lactate accumulation over the first 5 minutes of exercise. And this actually makes a lot of sense. And I just say that if the exercise is highly lactic, the lactate will accumulate quickly. The buildup will be quicker than an exercise that is less lactic. Even though at the end, as I said, they might reach the same level. And we just started to dig into all the literature to try to see how we could just extrapolate those 5 minutes, because sometimes researchers were actually providing lactate measures in the middle of the HIIT sequence or in between two series. So sometimes it was not exactly 5, but we had 3 or 4 or 6. So we had to extrapolate that. So back to your initial question, when we submitted that to SportsMed, the reviewers were just almost peeing on ourselves, saying that it was just completely rubbish science. And that's a nice segue to the review process of those two reviews, the 2013 SportsMed. They still have been the most painful comments, and the work to review and to respond to those comments, the most painful in my life over those. I don't know how many papers I've written now as a first author when I was in charge, but probably more than 150. And I would say I've never had so much pain to respond to because first of all, we had 3 reviewers, 3. So sometimes you just get 2. Now we got 3 reviewers, and each of them, they've done their job very well, so which is good. So they provided each of them 10 pages of comments. So it was a lot of work overall. But the thing is, we almost disagreed with 65% of their comments, because their comments were always going against, I would say, the common sense, or if we had to follow those comments, we would just not be able to make our points. So this is a nice one, but there's so much more about the neuromuscular side of the things. Being too sciencey would have never allowed us to make our cases as we did. And now, almost 10 years after and everything, I still believe that we were kind of right in pushing to do things halfway. That might not be perfectly as in the book, but I believe we were the first to bring some evidence at many levels, because we had found we found something, and we kept saying, hey guys, this is better than nothing. So either we try to do what you want and we don't do, and then the paper does not exist and we don't even send this review back, or, and thanks the editor, you guys agree that we can go something that is okay, but we make a step forward, or we make 10 steps forward in this situation. And thankfully, this is what happened, and I'm super happy and proud of us for having done that. But how painful have been those reviews?
It was awesome. Yeah. we got it back. I mean, and credit to the reviewers too, right? I mean, we we're kind of pissing on them, but it's like they put a lot of time on that. They're doing their best as well. And then credit to the editor too. I think it was Roger Olney way back then. It was almost like a 2-year process, just the review, or at least over a year. And it was incredible. There must have been 30 pages of review comments, two revisions. And luckily I even remember some of the reviewers were going back and disagreeing with other reviewers, which was great and helpful too. It was an excellent process and did reveal a great product at the end of the day. I mean, it's one of the most cited, pieces of work, I think, that's out there in our field. So, but yeah, the part 2 of the review was quite something to get published.
It was incredible. And I've been thinking a lot about and the efforts we had to put in. At this time I was traveling, I was in Bolivia at some stage. I was trying to find some time to get it done within the right time. And there was so much to do. There was so much work.
We didn't sleep much.
No, and those 2 reviews, the work was equivalent to a PhD manuscript. If I look at the PhDs I've been supervising, like 400 something references, and it was more than a PhD manuscript for those reviews. And just to finish the story about those reviews, is that what helped me, and I'm always, it's a nice story. It's so you've done 100 triathlons. I've done a few ultra trails going across the Reunion Island, and those races, because I'm not that good, I still needed close to 40 hours to finish those 100 miles or 176 kilometers. Incredible. Those races have taught me resilience and patience. If you just go, and with the effort and the work, you will get there. And I believe that if I had not done those ultra races, I would have not been able to review those papers.
Yeah.
In terms of the work commitment, it was so much work that, again, I was thinking, okay, I'm still in the dark in this island, and I just have 3 more hours to get to the next checkpoint and get some food. It was the same. Just get to the next 10.
The key point of any sports scientist or practitioner that's in there. I think and again, this is why I think we always believe that you should practice what you preach. I think training and actually getting out there and doing stuff, it just teaches you so much that you can bring into your professional life. Whatever it may be, all of those. So yeah, I mean, I've done 17 Ironman, and it's like, slogging it out in both training and the races itself. These are long races, like that. Just resilience. I think we definitely both sort of have that, and it just kind of spurs us along. Same with building HIIT Science. It wasn't super easy either, right? But you just keep plugging away, and with anything in life, you take that and one step, one foot in front of the other, and stuff gets done. So
exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we should probably finish up this podcast with the last one. We've really kind of alluded to this one. This is why when you look to part 2 of the reviews, both the anaerobic system and the neuromuscular system were covered in that one review, because the two are very coupled. They're very tied together. So target 3 is the neuromuscular musculoskeletal system. It's definitely related, but it's a little bit different, right? So we're talking here with the system, we're talking about muscle soreness. We're talking about maximal muscle recruitment. And then, lots of programming considerations with anytime you've got those in there, right? So, I was just again, back to that same athlete that I was talking about the other day. We've been doing a lot of, she's a high intensity athlete. So, she's getting the system taxed, and it creates that central nervous system fatigue, and you've got to consider that within your context and your programming. So this is the other one. I don't think the key aspect with this one, Martin, is that we don't really totally have a handle on this one yet, probably because it's so contextual, right? There's so many different ways that you can tax your musculoskeletal neuromuscular system. What do you think about with this one? This was and I even remember building the reviews out too. This was we even kind of debated about putting that one in there, but I'm so glad we did. And Of
course, because it's so central. It's almost for me in my practice, again, that's also where those reviews come from. It's not an academic exercise. It's just about explaining an overarching approach of how we've been working and programming in our own practices. So again, the entry is not an academic exercise. And I think it's true. The truth is that the necessity to consider neuromuscular strain and load is even more central in team sport again, because you need so much a combination of different training stimuli in your week, that everything that is around the concurrent training matters even more. I'm not saying that in other sports that does not matter, like the fact that you have to develop different physical capacities almost at the same time or within the same microcycle requires this effort of understanding what is the potential carryover effect of one content to the other. But in individual sports, you may have your training mesocycle or microcycle where you're going to have more emphasis on, let's say, building strength and speed maybe for a couple of weeks and then move to another. So the concurrent effect is a little bit less extreme. But in team sports, Tuesday it's strength, Monday it's endurance, and another day it's speed, for example. So if your high intensity training session is actually for about this concurrent effect, and we can discuss a bit further into that, but if for any reason you implement your high intensity training session with the aim of improving your metabolic function, which is what is meant to be implemented for at the start, but if at the same time you shoot yourself a bullet in the foot because the athlete is going to be tired for the speed session the day after, that might not be as efficient as you would like. So I think this is why, for me, in my context, team sport context, manipulating neuromuscular load has been probably the most important factor, and the need for the overall reflection about programming HIIT has been around this aspect. Whether I was working with handball, then in football, it's always about getting my metabolic dose using HIIT, but always considering those possible carryover effects with the external session of the microcycle puzzle. So that's the idea, and that's the why. And I think everyone understands that the context around what we call the concurrent training is about having two opposite stimuli, let's say on the same muscles or fibers that are going in opposite direction. So on the molecular side of the things, you're kind of saying to the cell, please improve your metabolic function, and half an hour after or an hour after or before, you say, oh, please improve your contractility and grow in size. And these are contradictory messages. But as explains very, very nicely Jackson 5 in our reviews, we know that this molecular pathway is not as clear, but it makes sense that there is this contradictory level of
interference
of signaling. Yeah. But what is very clear is the acute fatigue effect that is apparent after a session. And if you start a session in a fatigue state, and this session is supposed to be quality lifting, sprinting, jumping, plyometric drills, if you start with this session, whatever your sport, with the level of fatigue, this session is likely to be less effective. And this is super clear. This is super, super clear. So I think this argument just can't, the second one can't be debated about the importance of understanding this load.
I would say, you said there's one of probably the biggest lessons that you learned in team sports, and I would say it's exactly the same situation for me within the endurance sports as well. And apologies to all of the athletes that I hurt in the process of learning that lesson, legitimately, because that's you learn, and within the endurance realm, certainly the sport of triathlon, it's the sport of running, right? It's the application of running in certain running sessions and high intensity running sessions, or even too much of a neuromuscular load from too much inappropriately handled long sessions, or that's always gotten me in trouble. It's really allowed me to, I guess, appreciate that factor so much more. It's not just about metabolism, obviously. In hindsight, you've really got to look at that. It's probably the key one we need to kind of have a look at. But I still don't think we have a technology that's quite there that's going to help us guide that one. I think it's still at the moment, to me, it's probably communicating with the athlete. It's the athlete themselves being able to manage that, and it's common sense at the end of the day too, right? So with you kind of looking at that load.
Because so of course there's no real technology, but also there's so much that we would like to know about in relation to this overall neuromuscular skeletal load, because we talk about tendons, but it could also be the ligaments. Could be, of course, the muscles, but the tendon, the ligaments. There's just so much that we should be able, we would like to measure and assess. And also, again, how do you measure muscle activity? Okay, we know electromyography, which is surface on the skin. Okay, but how do you measure tendon strength, for example? Forget. So it's a bit same story with the anaerobic lactic system. It's very, very difficult to measure. So in this case, we had to find kind of other, not shortcuts, but use other measures that we can use as proxies. So in this case, some studies have provided some cool data on EMG, for example, so the muscle electrical activity. But it's unlikely to cover all the muscles, So we have to find out something, a way again to still do a few steps further. And this is where we did also kind of a trick where we tend to use external load to infer on internal load. And this is the first really bad thing that any sports scientist should not do working with athletes, because we know that there is always a dissociation between external and internal. And it's actually this dissociation that is very interesting in terms of adaptation. With all the external versus internal load, you can have a good track of athlete response. So assessing that, considering that a given external load relates to a given internal load, we're already half of shooting ourselves in a bullet in the foot. But that's the idea. The guiding principle is that the higher the external load, likely the higher the internal load as well. But we're not sure. Yeah. Because again, depending on the training status, a similar external load might provide a different internal load.
And this is why I'm always trying. This is why, again, communication with your athlete, if you're a coach out there, is just so critical. And whether that's, you're listening to comments that are written, if you're using an online sort of source, or you're on your video call with them, so you can actually hear what they're saying, and then it's teaching them as well to actually. I think that's the best, probably the best barometer of internal load, is if that athlete can actually get insight into how they're feeling, how that muscle tendon group is feeling, how much, I call it pop, how much pop does that athlete sort of have, and yeah, there's their brain, their mind should have some sort of insight into how things are sort of functioning down there. So yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So
exactly. But yeah, no, just to finish this with the use of external load. So the few options available to still, like, for a coach to have an idea of if the session is, let's say, taxing a lot the neuromuscular system or not. That's what we want. Is it really, as we were taxing a lot the lactator system or not? If there is an actual fatigue throughout the session, when I say fatigue, is the first repetition, the athlete is running 150 meters, and the end is running only 30 meters. There is likely a fatigue because the task is not being able to be reproduced. So this is an indirect evidence of muscle fatigue. But sometimes athletes will still be able to complete the task until the end. So there's not an obvious decrease in performance, as I can say, during the session. And this is where we've been working as well. We wrote a few, even a paper on that as well. More recently, we have those ability to measure, at least for running-based sports, stride mechanics. And even though, let's say, the output might not be changed, so the athlete might still be able to produce the same output, he might change the way he runs. He might go through longer contact times that might be related to changes in his leg stiffness, for example. And this is clearly related to neuromuscular fatigue as well. So we have some tools. But again, are you able to run every session with those specific devices that measure your contact time? Good question. That requires at the moment still analytics on the back of those measures to get your fatigue index, for example. And this isn't only about running. What about cycling? What about swimming? What about all the other modes of rowing, So it's very, very difficult to really measure this acute fatigue. And that was another big part of the battle during those reviews, to explain our points. And again, that was still better than nothing. That was always the argument we had. It's far from being perfect, but likely better than just nothing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I still think that technology and almost the combined measures of maybe, actually asking the athlete what's happening there, combined with some of the markers that you're saying that are measuring the external load, might be amalgamated to get some sort of better insight in the future, AI, etc., that brings it all together. But let's wait and see. Okay, I think we've had a pretty good overview of the three key physiological targets. And just to summarize, that they were the aerobic system. We're talking central heart and lungs, and also the peripheral musculature, the desaturation. The second system was the anaerobic system. And we have to consider the glycogen stores, the lactate response, and the effect on the CNS generally. And tied to that one is the neuromuscular system that we've just reviewed. And we're talking things like injury risk, the fatigue aspect, the perceived exertion, and its effect on the subsequent sessions. And the reason why those three systems are important is going to be onto something that we'll talk about next. And it's really what HIIT Science is all about, because we're going to talk about a system that you can use to help you program, because we can actually take all of these physiological responses and bring them into, we can kind of pair them in with formats that like training formats that are going to give you different degrees of these. Because what we've learned and discovered along the way is that depending on how you move the levers of training, you actually can get different degrees of this in different sessions, and it can be a form a very good model for yourself for your programming. So, anything further from you, Martin, on this episode 2?
No, I think we've just been a bit all over the place with those comments on the reviewers' comments. But no, I think the overall conclusion is that we have to be pragmatic and try to provide the least bad options often, try to get a better understanding. And even though it's not perfectly as it should be or perfectly as in the book, but again, I can say we can be proud of what we've done on this aspect, is that while finding those tricks, I'm sure we managed to move the needle a little bit further.
Yeah, well said, man. Let's hope. So yeah, give us your comments on today's episode. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again. Over and out from us.
Cheers. Bye bye.